Hey everyone, it's Crash Knife Fight, and since Anakin Skywalker made his appearance in Star Wars Battlefront 2, I have been pondering an issue that affects games and gamers. Typically, this is an issue with online multiplayer games, and Star Wars Battlefront 2 is certainly no exception to this problem. As gamers, we often encounter character classes, weapons, and items that shake up a game. How many times have you been playing your favorite shooter and you get killed by the same individual 2, 3, or maybe half a dozen times in a row using some new gear or a character that was recently added to the game? You get frustrated, angry, and start claiming that this new content is broken or game breaking, and you are petitioning the game developers to take notice and do something about it. The problem is, we often rush to judgment and we start conflating several different problems that occur in games. So today, I want to discuss the difference between overpowered, game-breaking, and broken. And yes, it is important. For this video, I'm using BF2 because the game provides good examples to reference. Let's start with overpowered. When a weapon, item, or character creates an advantage for individual players, it is overpowered. It's a situation often exploited by less skilled players and typically results in higher kill streaks, better survivability, or helps a player gain some type of perk or pad their score. Most often, overpowered items and abilities work exactly how the game developer intended. But because of some miscalculation or oversight by the developer, they possess more advantages than other items or characters within the game. These items and characters are sometimes so overpowered that they are game-breaking, but we need to differentiate these terms. Game breaking is when something in the game is so powerful or bugged out that it affects the outcome of the game. This occurs because no decent counter for this ability or item exists, or an item or character is so powerful that most players stop using their preferred loadouts in order to take advantage of the same overpowered item because they can't compete otherwise. Game-breaking phenomena are rarer than one would think. Lastly, there is something that is simply broken, which are weapons, items, and characters that are so glitchy or underpowered that they are useless. This does, in a sense, affect the outcome of a game because players will choose something else, but it's less of an issue than when something is extremely overpowered. So a good example of overpowered was Princess Leia from the time of BF2's launch until her secondary fire ability was nerfed. With star card upgrades, Leia's secondary fire could one-hit any trooper class from any range. The power of her secondary fire was the biggest offender, but it also had a generous lock-on and tracking ability. Point her blaster towards the little red icon denoting an enemy player and pull the trigger, and you were almost guaranteed a kill. Combine her secondary fire with the fact that she could stay out of harm's way, and 60 and 70 plus kill streaks were the norm on large maps like Hoth and Crate, and 100 plus were not uncommon. So why was this overpowered but not game-breaking? For starters, there was at least one way to counter her ability. Don't stand out in the open, dummy. Typically, after the first time I got tagged by Leia, I would make sure to find cover as soon as possible after respawning. Granted, that's more difficult on maps like Crate, but to be honest, is it any different than the tactic used to avoid specialists? Another reason she was not game-breaking was due to the slow rate in which she could discharge her secondary fire. Leia can single out one player at a time, but the ability is not going to wipe out whole squads in the blink of an eye. The slow rate of fire also made her less effective in confined spaces. She could still get off a shot or two with the secondary fire, and the primary fire on her blaster is still quite deadly, but her effectiveness was greatly diminished on faces of maps with interior spaces. Opposing players can find more cover and close the distance with her, and she always has to worry about getting flanked by a dark side lightsaber user. Taking this into account, while powerful, her abilities do not prevent the opposing team from winning, and her presence in the game did not require huge adjustments. There are lots of other examples of OP situations from BF2, like the heavy class's supercharged sentry at the time of the game's launch, and Finn's Deadeye ability when he made his way into the game. I'm not arguing that these characters and abilities did not need some adjustment, but it did not affect my overall enjoyment of the game. So what is an example of game-breaking then? These cases are rare. Some would point to Emperor Palpatine's lightning wall hack, but it's difficult to call this game-breaking because it worked the way the developers intended. Additionally, it did not change the outcome of games. It was just annoying. One game-breaking phenomenon was a bug with the Heavy Trooper's DC-15LE. The DC-15LE's rate of fire with the explosive shot was too high, and the overheat time was stretched out. This allowed the heavy to melt troopers as well as heroes and villains. So you may ask why this was game breaking and not overpowered. Because eventually nearly every player on a team was using the heavy. It was changing the makeup of the game. Another game breaking scenario was the buff to the heavy's ion torpedo. DICE buffed the ion torpedo to a 3-round magazine last summer. This buff virtually rendered all vehicles in the game useless. One heavy trooper could take out an AT-ST in a matter of seconds, and even starfighters were not immune to this weapon. As a result, the heavy trooper was gaining battle points even quicker than the officer class, and eventually, most players gave up on selecting vehicles, knowing that they would only last a few seconds in the game. A lot of players considered vehicles a nuisance, but they balance the game, and their absence, like it or not, means the game is broken. Game-breaking phenomena are often more subtle than many would consider. This leaves broken. This term is overused, and players use it to apply to any situation, including those described above. But it should be used with more restrictive parameters. Something is considered broken when it does not work as advertised by the developers due to inconsistencies and glitches. This usually happens after patches and updates. Occasionally, it may refer to a facet of a game that has never worked as advertised, or to an entire game that is so glitch-ridden that it devalues the content of the game. One example of broken was Luke Skywalker at the time of launch. It took DICE months to make Luke a viable hero in the game. His abilities were inconsistent, he was too slow, and his saber damage was pathetic. Although most of the issues that Luke suffered from were not glitch-oriented, but rather the way the developers intended him to play, he is still considered broken because he just lacked viability. A more recent example of a broken character was General Grievous at launch. Grievous's thrust surge and unrelenting advance for all intents and purposes did not work. Fortunately, his claw rush and damage output with his lightsabers prevented him from being completely useless. Fortunately, DICE straightened out this issue relatively quickly. Occasionally, a broken situation results in an overpowered ability or weapon. This was the case with the DC-15LE. I'm adding an addendum here to include one more term, unbalanced. Unbalanced often gets thrown in the mix with these other terms, but in fact, it is more of a result of level design and developer choices that cause unbalanced situations. It can be used to describe game-breaking situations, but it also applies to scenarios where something creates an advantage for a team unrelated to a game-breaking or overpowered scenario. In BF2, unbalanced scenarios have appeared in map level design, the most notorious of which is the first phase of Takodana. The Resistance team is able to rush players onto the objective and lock it down before the First Order gets anywhere close. They also have the advantage of the high ground. Yeah, I know, I said high ground, but it is a tactical advantage in this situation. Obviously, taking the objective is not impossible, but it requires a much more skilled First Order team than a defensive Resistance team. Another unaddressed balancing issue is the Geonosis map. It's a real struggle to stop the advance of the Clone Army in Galactic Assault. The health of the ATTEs nearly guarantees a victory for the First Order as long as they manage to get off of the first phase. While it's not impossible, these scenarios favor one side over the other, and that is the definition of unbalanced. So why does this matter? I realize separating these terms seems tedious and trivial, but it is important. As human beings, we tend to speak in bombastic and hyperbolic terms when we are annoyed and frustrated. When it comes to video games or a lot of other things in life, we want to find an excuse for our lack of success, find a scapegoat. Moreover, we can turn to social media and find people that are saying the same thing, and that reinforces our opinions, even when they are ill-conceived. Information comes at us so quickly, we often do not take the time to digest it all and think critically about it. So when a few people start overstating an issue, it snowballs. These terms are also used by YouTubers to get views and other media types to do the same thing to build their brand. The problem here is that game developers are taking note, and when they see a complaint growing and words like game breaking getting thrown around, they are going to step in and try to correct an issue. Keep in mind that game developers have a lot more data than anyone else, but popular opinion will be a large factor in their decision making. Often, this creates an issue where developers create more and bigger issues than the one they are attempting to fix. So what I'm preaching here is do not rush to judgment, the moment something is not going your way. Take time to think critically and analyze the issue. Do not discount someone else's opinion or experience simply because your experience differs. I mentioned earlier I have been pondering this issue since Anakin's release earlier in the week. I saw so many people saying he was game breaking, and yet when I was playing HVV, there were many matches that my team kept him from being a complete menace, and we won the game. The same goes for Galactic Assault. Likewise, there were some games where I used Anakin and I completely dominated, and others where I could barely get a kill. And that begs the question, how different is that from any other time I've played HVV? It's not at all. Let me finish this up by stating that this does not mean developers should not fix overpowered situations or broken facets of their game. I am just stating we should give developers and other gamers an accurate picture of what we are experiencing, and that requires communicating ideas with more precision. So that's all I have for now. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll be back soon with a new video.